smitten with the passion that he said that day in the living room. And I walked out of that room and I have never felt the same after listening to the facts and the figures, and his enthusiasm was infectious. So I think it's important that we start with you, Hugh Evans, because you brought some very powerful people together for this event. So what makes Global Citizen now different?
Well, firstly, I want to thank you, Gayle, for hosting today. And I also, yeah, let's give Gayle a round of applause. She's absolutely wonderful. And I want to thank all of you for being with us. The time that you're giving to be part of this makes the absolute world of difference. So Global Citizen Now is about driving decisive action to tackle the world's greatest challenges. And I think there's a couple things that make the next few days different to anything out there. Firstly, I think that if you think about, other summits that happen on the planet, like let's call it Davos, the World Economic Forum, or the GEA General Assembly, they're always behind closed doors and citizens are excluded. This is the complete opposite. This is an opportunity for citizens to interact with world leaders, with business leaders, with incredible artists, so that all of us can come together to create lasting change. It's about actually the power of citizens to take action. That is different to anything out there. That's why this is being streamed all over the world. I think secondly, it's about action. So what we've decided to drive is targeted actions. For those of you, when you came in through the door today and you gave your cell phone number, you will receive text messages throughout the entire 2 days of specific actions you can take. Because often if I go to a summit, I might hear an inspiring speaker, but then a few weeks later I might have forgotten about it, and then a month later it's a distant memory. Because we're going to be driving lasting action, we're kicking off campaigns over the next 2 days that will have a profound impact. And then finally, and most importantly, it's about mission. And the reason why it's about mission is that you're going to hear a lot about climate change over the next few days. And people might say, well, what has climate change got to do with Global Citizen's mission to end extreme poverty now? Well, absolutely everything. Because these are two sides of the same coin called sustainable development. And the only way that we're going to address the current deadlock in climate negotiations that's taking place right now, the reason why the last COP didn't succeed and the next COP won't be a guaranteed success unless we take action, is because there's a $16 billion funding gap that the world's wealthiest nations promised to the poorest nations, but they haven't delivered on. Yes. That creates a trust deficit. If you don't have trust, you don't make progress. And so over the next 2 days, we have the right people in the room with the most extraordinary heads of state, business leaders, artist leaders, foundation leaders, who can all come together with a movement of global citizens to create lasting change. And that's what's going to make the next 2 days last.
Yeah, and I know how much action means to you, Hugh. Even going to those great concerts, and we've all been, the lineup is always extraordinary. It's always people you want to see. Harry Styles, I love me some Harry, has been at Global Citizen. Beyonce, you name the names, they've all been there. But even to go to the concert, Hugh, you always make it clear you have to do something. You can't just say, oh, I love so-and-so, I want to go. You've got to do something to gain entry into the room. Madam President, you are a co-chair along with Hugh. We heard him talk about action. We heard him talk about accountability. What can you do to make sure that there is accountability? Because anybody can say, I want to donate, I want to do, but how do we hold people accountable? What's the best way to do that? Accountability and delivery.
Accountability and delivery, I think, to deliver on what you have promised, I think this is the hallmark of democracies. Because democracies live and thrive on trust. That people trust that the promises and the actions that are promised are really delivered. And therefore, I think it is so important. That's also the difference between democracy and autocracy, because we are accountable, thanks God, to a free press, to Global Citizen, to a vibrant civil society, and of course to the checks and balances that are out there in the political field. And that's what I am so amazed about what Global Citizen is concerned, because we met at the beginning of the pandemic. And you came and you said, let's organize, let's rally the world and let's organize a pledging for vaccines to fight the pandemic. And it was at that time 16 billion that we raised in one evening. But what was important, Global Citizens then tracked each and every single dollar and euro, that they were not only pledged at that evening, but that they were really paid into the system and that they were delivered. And the second time that we've been working together was on Ukraine, Russia's horrible war in Ukraine. And it was you who said, let's again rally the world and raise money for the Ukrainian refugees. And it were 8 billion euros that you raised for Ukrainian refugees. And here I was so amazed because you could just feel that people understood that the Ukrainians are not only fighting for their independence, the integrity and, of their territory and their sovereignty, but that they are fighting for all of us, what the respect for the international law is concerned, what the respect for the UN Charter is concerned. And therefore it is so important that we all support Ukraine for as long as it takes. And again, accountability and delivery, to deliver on the subjects that you have pledged on or where you have promised things, this is the essence of democracy. And to fight for democracy, this is the most noble task that we can fulfill.
Mm-hmm. You know, it's a thing, Hugh, you were really from the school, if you don't ask, you don't get. And you have never, ever shied away from asking. Both of you, the Hugh squared, I can say that about the both of you. Sabrina, the motto is where ideas become impact. And I know you've worked really closely with global citizen campaigns connected to food and hunger and the climate crisis. You know, we're not all just sitting up here looking pretty. We really want to make a difference. And we know that these conversations and these panels, and you get this message out, makes a difference. So what have you seen since you started working with Global Citizen? I think finally, especially when it comes to climate, you know, back in the day, people's eyes would glaze over. And then the more examples you give and the more educated you become, you realize, Houston, we have a problem.
I think that's absolutely right. I think we aren't just here, you know, just on a soapbox, lending a nice outfit like Gayle's, because Gayle, you do look nice.
Say looking pretty. Go ahead.
I'll take it. But what I've learned through the years with Global Citizen, and actually I met Global Citizen doing a field visit, I don't know if you remember, Hugh, Mick was there, with the International Fund for Agricultural Development, who I am now UN Goodwill Ambassador for and proudly for, and they were in the trenches doing the work. And it took me a moment to realize, because in my mind at that time, you know, Sierra Leone had just come out of the Ebola pandemic, which is where we were. Global Citizen, NIFAD were there picking up the pieces, not knowing, ironically, we were about to go into a global pandemic. If somebody had told me that back then, I mean, I don't know what I would have thought, but it's so much more than what happens when you're in those field visits. It's the follow-up, it's the ask, like Gayle said, and Hugh is not shy to ask. None of the Global Citizen team are. But it really is that accountability to leaders, to summits that we go to the panels that we are having. What is the follow-up behind those panels? And I've seen, and I'm so thankful to say, have been a part of firsthand some of those commitments that have been made, you know, and there's been a few along the way and some really important ones, and some I'm really proud of. Canada, my own home country, stepped up when the pandemic was happening to help support a rural stimulus facility when countries were suffering at the most, because let's be honest, like Gayle said, people roll their eyes when we're talking about climate, but climate is such it's so much bigger than something that's happening when we get to 1 degree or whatever people talk about. It's happening to rural people now. People are waking up, not knowing what the weather is going to be tomorrow, having failed crops. I mean, these are real life disasters, real life situations that are on the doorsteps of so many. And it's picking up the pieces and finding solutions in real time that help people that are going through these issues in real time. Climate has exactly everything to do with gender. I mean, women make up the majority of the informal markets. They're a majority of the rural populations that we are supporting. Climate has to do so much with education. How are you sending your children to school if you're worried about what you're going to eat tomorrow? It's so much a bigger conversation than I initially thought. And it's easy to roll our eyes because it seems like something that's coming 10, 15 years down the road. But the work that we do now help support the people who have been forgotten along the way. And those are people in rural communities who are suffering through climate change today, not tomorrow. So I'm so thankful for the work that we've done together and the commitments that we've made. And it really is it's a blessing to be a part of, but the work is important in the follow-up. And the follow-up is something I think that you've done a really good job highlighting.
Yes, I mean, Sabrina, if you don't have the planet, what do you have? You know, and I think people really need to understand how dire this is. Do you have something, do you have just a little climate nugget, I call it for lack of a better word, that the first time you heard this statistic or you heard this philosophy, you said, oh, we better pay. Did you ever have a holy shit moment about something about climate that sort of jarred you into reality?
There's so many holy S moments, which but to be honest, hearing that, you know, the people who we support through EFAD, who are rural people around the world in the agricultural sector, feed a third of the world's planet. 1/3. How are we forgetting about people who feed a third of our planet? And how are they going to do that if we don't help support them fight climate change and protect them when nature is literally knocking on their door? It was astonishing to me, the lack of funding, the lack of awareness. And because these people look like me and you, Gayle, these are black and brown people around the world, rural people who have not had an opportunity to express the pain. And, you know, when we do these visits and I get an opportunity to meet some of these people, I just think, oh gosh, like these are the voices we should be championing. And Global Citizen, if anything, has done that, has had an amazing way of highlighting voices that have not been heard, who don't make news segments. And that's something that I'm really proud of.
Yes, yes, yes. Hugh Jackman, I can't stress enough the impact that night in your apartment that day, listening to Hugh Evans speak. And I know that since then, you've been involved from the very, very beginning, and you've really encouraged other people to get involved. I would imagine that Hugh calls you at all hours of the day and night back in the day. Was there ever a time when your caller ID said Hugh Evans and you said, not here?
When I said not here.
But that you didn't pick up the phone because you're thinking, oh, Hugh Evans is calling again.
No,
and I'm only kidding about
he was sleeping on my couch.
It's true.
Is that true?
Yeah, so there was no getting away from him. So I'm just coming up, I've got a meeting, and I'm like, Hugh, it's been 8 days.
I didn't realize.
We haven't told that story before, but that is true.
I have another very important statistic, because I was there not very long ago in Turks and Caicos at Hugh Evans' 40th birthday. So he's no longer a child. I just want to be very clear.
Yes.
This baby face is actually a grown-up.
Yeah, don't be fooled by the baby face. But
Hugh
what results
is relentless.
Go ahead. Hugh is what?
He's relentless.
He really is, but relentless in a good way.
Yes.
Sometimes people are relentless and it's extremely annoying with a capital A. This is not what this man does, and I can't stress that enough. No. I encourage all of you to figure out a way to have a conversation with him if you haven't already. But Hugh Jackman, since you've been here from the very start, what changes and results have you seen over the years?
Oh, so many changes. I mean, it was 2008 when we first met. And I was so impressed by Hugh as a man, as a young man, his vision. He was clear, he was a disruptor. Yeah. But
before people even thought about disruptors.
Right.
It was that, yes.
But will it sustain, and will there be trust built, as you said, Madam President? And that is what has been so extraordinary, I think, by Hugh's leadership and the entire team at Global Citizen. And now here we are, 10 concerts now in Central Park. There's been 33 million actions taken by global citizens. There's been $43 billion raised because of those actions, and 1.3 billion lives affected. Wow. That's a lot from one organization. And this started as an idea 14, 15 years ago. But what has been extraordinary is how it's just grown year in, year out. And we saw incredible work, as you said, with Ukraine, with COVID. Yeah. We continue to see great work. And I know it's going to keep growing because this is a movement. It's like it started as a very bright light. I was like, this is an amazing idea. It is now a wildfire. And it is just scorching through. And it's really at a tipping point now where I feel it could become really one of the major forces for real change.
Mm-hmm. It did. It started out as a little bright light, and now it is a wildfire. And can I say this, guys? None of us want to get burned. Sabrina, what specific actions do you think that citizens and government leaders can take to address the root of food insecurity?
You know, and just to the point, again, that Hugh was making about how global hunger and climate are an inseparable conversation now. For me, it's adaptation, adaptation, adaptation. It's about protecting and creating ways for rural people to protect themselves against the effects of climate change. And, you know, countries really are now, I think, after many a bilat with Hugh and Mick, starting to understand that long-term thinking is what we need to switch to. You know, there's a lot of short-term solutions. When you see a famine, these things are important, aid is important, but what are we doing to keep these instances from happening again? For instance, you know, I'm Somali, and I don't know if you're aware of what's happening in Somalia right now, but there's another famine. Another famine. It doesn't have to be this way. I mean, we need to set in stone measures to build resilience for rural people so that when these things do happen, we're not hearing the F word again and again. I've heard it my whole life now, and I'm sick of it. So just to be able to, you know, pick up with governments, and, you know, actually even Germany stepped up and cleared arrears for Somalia when it came to EFAD so that we could unlock 30 million in new funding to be able to spend towards adaptation. It's 1% of the funding at the moment, and it needs to be at least 50% when you're talking adaptation and mitigation. So I'm looking forward to picking up on those conversations. And then on a individual level, and one of the reasons I think panels like this are so important, it's about listening, learning, and using your voice, because everybody in this room now has learned something from one of the panelists up here that they can now share or help spread the information for. My mom always said to me, you know, your voice is the most important thing you have, because even if you can speak to one person, you are influencing some kind of change. And it is so important to remember that Global Citizen provides everything you need to be able to use your voice in a way that actually matters, and that's all they're asking. If you don't have $1 to your name, your voice is worth more. So I think it's so important to remember that.
I also think that for those people who have the power of the microphone, please use it for good, because there will come a time when you will no longer have the microphone. And could we just say congratulations and happy anniversary to Sabrina. She and her lovely husband, Idris Elba, have been just celebrated an anniversary here in New York City, and now she's with you. Happy anniversary. Happy anniversary.
Thank you.
Hugh Jackman, you said that sustainability is something, and I've seen this in action with you, that you've been very passionate about your whole life. So can you share with the audience how you took that passion that you have and you turned it into action?
I went to Ethiopia 2009 as an ambassador for World Vision, and we did some work with fair trade farmers. I met a guy called Dukali. He had 5 children, a 6th on the way, and I spent a day working with him in his farm, and he didn't speak a word of English, and somehow by the end we became friends. And
how do you spend a day, Hugh, for a second, working with somebody on their farm and they don't speak English and you don't speak their language? How did you communicate that way?
He just pointed, do this, like, gave me the shovel, do this, and I just followed.
Got it.
And it was the hardest work I've ever done. I'm an actor, after all. I'm like, Carly, I can do this for like 30 minutes, that's it. But I made a promise to him that I would do whatever I could to help farmers like him, fair trade farmers. And so in New York City here, me and my partners started a non-for-profit cafe, Laughing Man Coffee, which is down on Duane Street, if you want to go and get it. We give our profits back to the farmers we buy from, like Dukali.
Could you say the name of that again, please, Hugh?
Laughing Man Cafe. Okay. There's 2 of them, a 3rd on the way, but it was just a small way for us to connect the dots, and to how I could use my platform, hopefully to make a difference to the people we met. You know, because I think, as Sabrina was saying, there's so many small farmers like Dukali who are on the edge. One bad season, it's all over. You know, the instability and the insecurity they live with is just unimaginable to most of us here. And a little bit of help from us goes such a massive, massive way. And I always go back. My dad used to remind me, you know, what Mandela always said. Poverty is not natural. It's not a normal state of being. It may be around, but it is human-made, and it can be human-corrected as well. It's up to all of us. There's more than enough resources for everyone on this planet. We just have to find creative ways to share them.
Yes, poverty is not natural. I love that point. Hugh, I know, Hugh Evans, you've never backed down from a challenge, and so I want to end with Madam President, but before we do that, what's the first step you think we can all take to make an impact?
Well, I think Firstly, it's important to realize that in this room are some absolutely extraordinary people. I'm going to single a few people out. Michelle Anthony and Kelly Curtis at the front are two of the most important leaders in the music industry in the United States. Prime Minister Erna Solberg of Norway, who ran the entire Norwegian economy for the last 10 years and is now joined the Global Citizen Board. Richard Curtis at the back there, who's probably the greatest filmmaker of our entire time and is also the champion of the Sustainable Development Goals. In this room are the people you can work with to drive campaigns that can create lasting change. And on the topic of Prime Minister Solberg, I want to share with you one example that shows the power of citizen action. A few years ago with Stephen Colbert, when Solberg was still Prime Minister, we launched what we called the Twitter invasion of Norway for girls' education. And one night on Stephen Colbert's show, together with Global Citizens, we sent so many tweets to Prime Minister Solberg that she called us from Oslo the next day and said, "Come to Oslo. I'm sick and tired of seeing all your tweets. I'm in the middle of a local election and I need you to shut up." And true story. And so we flew to Oslo. I'm not joking. This is actually what happened. We flew to Oslo the next day and she said, "What do you want?" in a bit nicer way than that. And 2 months later, beg your pardon, she got up on stage at Global Citizen and committed $200 million for girls' education. So that's the power of... And I say that because the next few days, you're about to hear, in addition to what you've already heard, you're about to hear from people who have plans to create lasting change. Mia Mottley, the Prime Minister of Barbados, who's with us right now, has been one of the few people who've championed the issue of fair financing for the emerging markets and for the developing world. Most of the world's poor don't live in the poorest economies, they live in the middle-income countries. So you actually have to address this as an issue of fair financing globally. Now, the thing that we're going to do as part of the next few days is we're going to make it easy to take action, but it only starts there, it doesn't end there. And what I mean by that is that I don't know if any of you are golfers in the room, if you play golf, but we're not going to ask you to hit a hole-in-one on a par 4. Yeah. We're going to put it right up to the, thanks, T-Box, you're a legend. You can
Thank
tell
you,
I'm
Mr.
not a
Dolan.
golfer.
Thank you.
And we're going to help make it easy to get that putt in, right? And that's just the beginning. That's the example of that campaign with Prime Minister Solberg. But I want you to all design campaigns because no one has a monopoly over good ideas. And we need the ideas of young entrepreneurs from all around the world who want to design the next campaigns from Global Citizen, who are going to take over my role, who are going to take over Mick's role, who are going to take over all of our roles, because it's not about us. The mission is always greater than all of us, and that's what we're fighting for.
Yes. Thank you, Hugh. Madam President, I want to close this session with you because this number is pretty staggering to me. Listen to this, guys. Wealthy nations promise to mobilize $100 billion annually to help developing countries who are disproportionately impacted by climate change. But they are $16 billion short. That's a very big gap. What do you think can be done to make sure they step up and honor their promise? We talked in the beginning about trust deficit.
Yes, you're right. This is a big gap, and it is shameful that we have not been able in the last years to fill that gap. The European Union has stepped up. We have contributed 23 billion to the 100 billion, but the 16 billion are still missing. So we have to rally my peers that we come up with the 16 billion this year because, I just said it's a question of trust and disappointment. And we cannot disappoint those who are benefiting from the $100 billion. So you have my word that I will do everything this year to find, those who have not delivered so far and discuss tough with them.
Should we shame them?
Well, send text messages. This is good. And tweets. And as much as you can, yes, as much as you can nudge them toward that. And of course, it's my job also to rally my peers and to say, listen, we have to fill these 16 billion. But we also can do more than that. It's not 100 billion only. You said it, Sabrina, that it is the action that counts, that has to be done now. And I think the highly developed country, first of all, have to deliver themselves. We are the polluters. So this was, for me, the most important part when I started my mandate to have a very clear political vision. This is the European Green Deal. We have cast our goals in a law, because I think only what gets measured gets done. So I'm a big fan of goals that you can then follow up whether they are being delivered. And we have by now put a price on carbon, not only in industry, but we're just finalizing the law to put a price on carbon in road transport, in buildings, in maritime, in aviation, because a price on carbon means very simply, if you want to pollute, you have to pay heavily. If you don't want to pay, well, then innovate and go into renewables, for example, go into clean technologies. And this is the way out, and it works, it works. But it's not only the work at home, it's also the work abroad. And there we have started a program that we call Global Gateway, where we invest together with countries, for example, from the Global South. Because if we speak about fighting climate change, we speak about clean energy, we speak about wind, we speak about solar, it's green hydrogen, and these resources are in abundance in the Global South. So it's in our common interest that we invest, for example, in green hydrogen that is being produced, for example, in Africa and used in Africa, but for them also a source of income by having the European Union as somebody who says, we are willing, of course, to take the green hydrogen that you want to export. Or, for example, invest in the Great Basin to prevent deforestation. Invest in electric mobility in, for example, Bangladesh or Costa Rica. So all these are projects we are following up. And I want to say today, because it's not only action over time, but it's action now, that as European Union, we have decided together with the European Investment Bank that we will mobilize another 18 billion euros to make sure that there is investment in critical infrastructure in the Global South to fight climate change together. It's action now that counts.
All right, Madam President. You have had the last word. You've had the last word. Thank you so much. Over the next 2 days, guys, you're going to be hearing from artists, world leaders, private sector, and global citizens from all around the world on this planet. We're going to find out what action every one of us can take to address the most critical issues that are facing the world. This is the place where ideas become impact people. Thank you for your time. Thank you.
Nearly 7 million lives, and likely many more, and unraveled decades of progress in human development. We come together 14 months after Russia's invasion of Ukraine has accelerated a global food crisis. Tonight, 828 million people will go to bed hungry. We come together on a planet that, despite some meaningful policy advances, is still on a path to warm by about 3 degrees Celsius. Today, we're blowing past targets and broken promises on the way to an outcome that threatens the lives and livelihoods of billions of people. Unfortunately, too many of these people feel alone in facing these overlapping crises. Despite historic efforts, the world's institutions have not met this moment. The extraordinary leaders and activists here today have put forth proposals that could unlock trillions of dollars in public and private financing to give everyone the opportunity to live and thrive in the 21st century. Simply put, we must turn these ideas into actions now, because the next pandemic will not wait. Climate change will not wait. And the people on the front lines of these crises shouldn't have to wait either. Fortunately, in Paris in June, world leaders will come together with an opportunity to decide how to fund the fight to slow climate change and restart human development. Today, we're going to talk about what needs to happen before and after that summit to meet the moment. So let's get started. Vanessa, welcome. You were on the cover of Time magazine. You've been invited to speak in front of some of the most powerful and influential leaders on the planet about climate change, its impacts, and how to resolve it. You've pointed out that promises are made over and over and are rarely kept. What should global citizens, activists, do between now and the Paris summit in June to change that equation?
Thank you very much. First of all, I think we need to ask ourselves the question, why do our leaders always ask young people to inspire them? Why do our leaders always ask young people to challenge them? The science has been very clear. The IEA has been very clear. We cannot have any new fossil fuel development if we want to limit global temperatures below 1.5 degrees Celsius. The first rule, when you find yourself in a hole, is to stop digging. We are in a climate crisis. So the very first thing that we need to do, that our leaders need to do, is to stop all new investments in fossil fuels. And secondly, to help people that are suffering right now on the front lines of the climate crisis, people who are not responsible for this crisis. To speak of Africa as a continent, it is responsible for less than 4% of the global emissions. But we are seeing some of the worst impacts of the climate crisis. So one, no new investments in fossil fuels, and two, helping the communities that are on the front lines of this crisis.
Well, thank you. And Prime Minister Motley, Barbados is both on the front lines of the climate crisis, and to Vanessa's second point, you have brought together the global community in Bridgetown last summer to craft a set of proposals to allow us to actually, for the first time, seriously protect vulnerable nations, vulnerable communities, and vulnerable families around the planet in a way that brings equity and justice to those who have long been left behind. What are the solutions you propose that would actually deliver the financing and the opportunity that the world so desperately needs?
I think I'm going to come to that in a minute, but I do want to say to Vanessa that we have to be conscious that we're not a one-issue world. And what we don't want is to ban investment in all fossil fuels and then end up with people dying from poverty or other sources that will lead to their demise. I think we can all agree that no new investment in oil, but we are clear that we are going to need a bridging fuel, which is natural gas, if we're going to sustain populations. How long we use it, I agree with you, needs to be as short as possible, but this is the real world and not just a conversation on a platform. With respect to the financing issues, look, without the oxygen, we're not going to be able to adjust ourselves to prepare for this crisis. And it's not climate change, it's a climate crisis. And to that extent, we believe that the multilateral development banks have to treble their lending. We believe that we have to confront the reality that there are already 50 countries, 52 countries to be precise, on debt row. And those are because of facing a polycrisis moment, from the pandemic to the climate to the increased inflation for whatever reasons. 3, we need to unlock far more private sector capital, but that means unlocking risk. And we need to deconstruct risk, because the people in the global south borrow at far more expensive rates than the people in the global north. That's why the plant that was announced with such pomp in Glasgow for South Africa hasn't gotten off the ground. So, I mean, we can go into more details, Raj, but I'm conscious of the time. But suffice it to say that these and many other initiatives are part of the Bridgetown Development Fund, Bridgetown Agenda for Development Funding. You cannot have development funding as short-term money. You cannot have children, young people, rather, securing mortgages at for 30 years in a way that countries can only get development funding for 10 and 12 years to build schools. And it is that disparity in terms of how the financial system works, not just the World Bank and the IMF, but the whole financial system's focus on short-term gains, short-term everything, has literally propelled the developing world to the edge of a crisis. And I hope that we can change that mindset in, obviously, the IFIs, but across the entire financial system.
Prime Minister, I'm going to ask you to follow up on that. Why, that is a radical vision of change and transformation, and you've been an eloquent voice for global leadership to make it real. What gives you confidence that such a bold vision of reforms and changes is possible today?
Because we want to save the planet, and because we want to make sure that people can live. The reality is that we do not yet know how to live on planet Mars. We only know how to live on Earth. And the same oil and gas companies, bankers, transport companies, insurance companies, they're living on the planet Earth too. So what does it make sense to earn hundreds of billions of dollars in profit for only 10 or 20 years rather than being able to sustain profit for the next century or two? The reality is that we need to put a place in the middle, and everybody needs to leave something in the middle. Nobody's asking to bankrupt companies. Nobody's asking to do the impossible with the international financial institutions. I think the consensus is developing. Here's the problem: scope and pace. If I have a heart attack and I'm going to the emergency room and I don't get help immediately, it doesn't matter how well-intentioned you are. So scope and pace matter at this point in time. Not 5 years from now, not 3 years from now, this year, right now.
Thank you. Chris, moving away from fossil fuels and moving towards clean energy is part of living up to the vision that Prime Minister Motley just laid out. Coldplay has been a leader in sustainable living and sustainable touring, and you've been a voice for real change and real accountability. And people follow your lead. Millions, tens of millions, maybe hundreds of millions around the world. How do you get people to follow you down this path, and what can we do together to get more people to follow to create a climate-sensitive future?
Thanks, Raj. Hi, Mia.
Hi, Chris.
Vanessa. I'm sorry I'm not there in person. I had to go to the doctor. What was the question again, Raj? How do we get people to follow the lead?
How do we get hundreds of millions of people to follow your lead, the Prime Minister's lead, and Vanessa's lead to actually change our climate outcome?
Well, that's a wonderful question. What we decided to do in the last couple of years was just focus on what we could do and hope that other people might see it being successful rather than telling people what to do. Because we approached this most recent tour with the goal that we had to prove, or we have to prove, that thinking about the climate doesn't mean you can't do well economically, that being environmentally conscious is not a charitable thing, it's also economically viable. So we set out with that mission, and that's the way that we think we can show people to try it for themselves, is to show that it's profitable and sensible and not just philanthropic.
Well, thank you, and I think it's certainly true when you show that, you're likely to get many, many more followers than the rest of us, but it's a mantra we can all, in fact, live by in trying to be role models. Vanessa, I want to come to you before going back to others on the panel, because you've talked about loss and damage, in the context of the COP climate meetings. The Prime Minister's been also an eloquent voice on loss and damage. What does loss and damage mean to you? And why are you so focused and passionate about ensuring that countries, including the wealthiest nations, kind of recognize and respect the concept of loss and damage in this fight?
Well, the climate crisis is evidently wreaking havoc on so many communities, not only across Africa, but many, across the global south. And many people are being pushed, beyond the places of adaptation. You cannot adapt to the loss of your cultures. You cannot adapt to, the loss of your history. You cannot adapt to starvation. For me, this is where loss and damage comes in. And that's why it's important that we not only aim at the establishment of a loss and damage fund, but that actual money, because it's still an empty bucket that needs to be filled. And, children that are starving, they don't feed on empty buckets, or communities that are, experiencing cyclones or floods. So there's really a need for our leaders to keep up with their promises. There is always a gap between what is promised and what is done. And we've seen that, from the $100 billion, and now we have this loss and damage fund. It's really important that our leaders keep up with their promises. We've seen countries like Mozambique have to get high interest loans in order to address impacts of the cyclone Ida in 2019 that left over 1,300 people dead. So for me, it's really what we need to do, because people are already talking about loss and damage and what is needed. It's about what leaders must do to keep up with their promises.
Well, I'm so glad you describe it that way, because loss and damage is about, as you point out, understanding that we need a systemic solution so people don't go hungry because of climate change's impacts on agriculture or because of the current economy's impacts on interest rates. Prime Minister Motley, you have made the point that you are, if I can say this publicly, tired of small one-off solutions and demanding a more full, systemic solution to the injustice that is represented. Well, how did you get to that statement, and how do we help create a movement that solves the injustice that got you there?
Well, I think we all know the injustice that got us there. When we started to create the new modern world in 1945, it was just 50 countries. We're now almost at 200 countries. And if, therefore, what mattered to 50 is what the world looks like, then we're not going to solve the problems of the almost 200. Secondly, we need to know that the purpose of the institutions when created were for reconstruction from the Great War. They were also to be able to fight poverty. You heard Hugh earlier say that 70% of poor people don't live in poor countries. They live in middle-income countries. But yet the rules of engagement and the rules of access exclude them. I'm glad that Vanessa talked about loss and damage, because countries do not need more debt. They need help to be able to fight a crisis that they didn't create. And therefore, if we're going to be true to the moment, we need to ensure that those countries and those communities have access to money that doesn't put them on debt row. So I believe that the systemic unlocking of risk, the systemic unlocking of international finance, that all of these things are critical, because guess what? In addition to the climate crisis in 2019, we got the pandemic. In addition to the pandemic of 2020, we got the war in Ukraine and the expenditure for coming out of quantitative easing in the northern world that led to inflation. In addition to the inflation and the pandemic and the climate crisis, looms artificial intelligence and looms also the future pandemic of antimicrobial resistance. If we don't solve today's problems today, God knows what else we're going to be solving on top of today's problems tomorrow. That's why we need to make commitments now, as opposed to 2 years or 1 year or 3 years, and moving from changing the equity to loan ratio at the World Bank from 20% to 19%, a lot of technical Babel, what does it mean? $5 billion a year when the world needs 2.4 trillion. Now, bear with me, the 2.4 trillion is not only about public money, as you know. We probably need 500-600 billion of public money, and then a lot of that to unlock private sector capital. So we just need to we need to take the Nike ad, just do it.
Chris, I'm going to come to you on the Nike ad. Just do it. Because you know the power of using your platform, using your voice, and using your fame to make a tremendous impact. And we have a question that global citizen Stephen Kirk from the United Kingdom asked us on social media. Stephen asks, how do we inspire others to participate in climate action? What pathway worked for you? And what would you recommend to say to others who are not currently engaged in this fight?
Okay, well, firstly, what me or Prime Minister Motley said is that you just have to remind everybody that this is where we all live, and you can be a trillionaire, but if there's no planet, there's nowhere to spend money. That's the main thing, is to help people understand that this affects you too. Even if you think it doesn't at the moment, it will. So I feel that if you can engage people's own sense of self-preservation in a way, that's a really good thing, that none of us are immune to what's happening to the planet. I think that it's not really about someone who's famous or someone who's, it's not about preaching, it's about, this is why I love Global Citizen, it's about engaging your voice and understanding that if you join another 90,000 people and all email Ron DeSantis or whoever, you know, that makes a wave, and the power is in community. And Global Citizen is wonderful from my perspective because it's a non-elected force, you know, a powerful force. And yeah, that's my answer.
Well, thank you, Chris. I think your point about global citizens everywhere taking action, getting political leaders to pay attention, to live up to promises, to understand that hunger and starvation in a part of Uganda that you witnessed as a result, Vanessa, of climate change is not only a challenge in Uganda, but in fact a threat to every one of us, to our basic being. And so thanks to all of you for crafting a path forward for the world. I will say, as the Prime Minister noted, nearly 80 years ago, after the deaths of at least 60 million people during the Second World War, world leaders came together to prevent that kind of catastrophe from ever happening again. They established, as the Prime Minister noted, the UN, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund. They created institutions to create a safer, more integrated, and more prosperous world. Now, 3 years after the start of a pandemic that killed at least 7 million people, and amid a climate catastrophe that, as Chris just pointed out, is an existential threat to humanity, we have not seen anything like that level of ambition, that scale, and that effort. We have 57 days until the Paris summit begins. What can we do, what can you do in those 57 days to meet this moment? That's the question we should ask ourselves today. Our incredible panelists have given us some good initial answers, but most importantly, they've given us and me hope that we can build a brighter future together. Thank you.
Hugh Evans, Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Mottley, and Global Citizen Ambassador, Hugh Jackman.
Today, increasing inequality and climate change threaten to undo a generation's progress on ending extreme poverty. The world's poor have done the least to cause climate change, and yet they are getting hit first and the hardest. Drought-induced famine is starving parts of Africa, and small island nations are at risk of devastating sea level rises. Where you live should not determine if you live.
To address these issues, I'm proud to announce the Power Our Planet campaign. We are calling on world leaders, the private sector, and the World Bank specifically to step up loans and funding for the world's most vulnerable countries so they can transition to clean energy and withstand natural disasters. And I'm pleased to announce that Prime Minister Mottley is our campaign co-chair.
Thank you. Thank you, and please, Mia, and I just want to talk to the Global North and the Global South, because for the first time, our populations are facing the same reality in a very long time. We live on one planet, and if we don't get this right, there is nowhere else to go. And I need more than ever the citizens of the North and the citizens of the South to band together to send the message that we must act now to save tomorrow.
Thank you so much, Prime Minister. The Power Our Planet campaign calls for 3 big changes. Firstly, governments need to deliver on past promises. That's $16.7 billion in climate funding for vulnerable countries that have been promised but not yet delivered. Our team has crunched the numbers, and we need the US Congress to approve President Biden's $11.4 billion commitment. But because yes, absolutely, we do. But because we know that US Congress is in a deadlock, we also need the UK, France, Germany, Japan, and Canada to step up immediately. Secondly, the private sector has a hugely important role to play. We have specific asks for every company, starting with being net zero and having a time-bound action plan to achieve it. Private sector leaders, we're reaching out to you directly about how you can do your part.
And yes, we also need to change the notion that development money can be short-term money. It cannot be easier for a young person to get a 30-year mortgage than for a country to get development funds to save people and to save the planet. And your voice is needed to be able to say, short-term works for fast food, it doesn't work for development.
Okay, so to achieve this, we all need to get to work. Now, you're going to see Power Our Planet campaign at the G7, the G20, the Global Citizen Festival, and a COP. And you'll see it at a special summit hosted by President Macron in Paris in June. We need all of you to take action now. So scan the QR code on the screen to start. We must act today to save tomorrow.
Thank you.
Thank you.